I'd like to get started. Introduce our speaker today. Dr. Dina Berman is Professor of Educational and Psychological Studies and Director of the PhD program in Community Wellbeing at the University of Miami. She is an internationally renowned expert on the psychology of immigration, particularly on refugee mental health, acculturation and adaptation of immigrants and refugees, and community-based interventions to improve their mental health and well-being. As a refugee from the former Soviet Union herself, she is interested in how culture shapes human behavior. Dr. Berman has conducted research on acculturation and adaptation of adolescent, adult, and elderly refugees, including those from the former Soviet Union, Central America, Somalia, and Vietnam, and on the multicultural competence of community-based mental health services for diverse children and youth who are refugees. As a community psychologist, she examines these topics from an ecological perspective, studying the impact of characteristics of the schools and receiving communities, and in collaboration with refugee resettlement service providers. Her research has been funded by NIMH, SAMHSA, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and other foundations, as well as various states and universities. Dr. Berman was a member of the American Psychological Association Immigration Task Force that co-authored the highly cited and influential 2012 task force report, Crossroads, The Psychology of Immigration in the New Century, and is also an author of numerous peer-reviewed articles and other publications. She is a member of the American Psychological Association Council of Representatives and a fellow of the APA and of the International Academy for Intercultural Research, where she also serves as editor-in-chief of its flagship journal, the International Journal of Intercultural Relations. Today, we're very pleased to have Dr. Berman speaking on alternate selves, adjustment, and acculturation among adolescent immigrants and refugees. Dina.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jack, for the invitation and the kind introduction. I would like to talk to you generally about immigration issues and psychology of immigration, and end with a current project that I'm working on, and where the title Alternate Selves will become self-evident. But I want to start by saying that, we all know the words here and the picture of the Statue of Liberty, and migration today is quite controversial and represents a really important topic that all of us see every day in the news. And of course, we have this history and tradition of being a country of immigrants and the American dream, and the idea that people can come here and become what they want to be. The idea that the country is a meritocracy that rewards hard work. But this is a saying, an old Italian proverb that I saw when I went to Ellis Island. And it reads like this. Well, when I came to America, I came to America because I was told the streets were paved with gold. When I got here, I found out three things. First, the streets weren't paved with gold. Second, the streets weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them. And that's kind of the story of migration today. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a historical and political context for where we are today and how we got here in terms of migration issues in this country. I want to talk a little bit about some thinking I've been doing about navigating these three philosophical issues of human rights, social justice, and cultural diversity issues, and how they fit together and sometimes don't fit together. I'll talk to you about acculturation and adjustment. I'll say a few things about interventions with immigrants and refugee youth. And I will end with my current interest and a project that I've been doing on what I call late arriving immigrant adolescents, those who come in into the country in adolescence. So in terms of the context, I don't know how visible this is. So a few things I want to say. There is this background in our history, in early American history, of the idea of citizenship, which was granted to free white people in 1790. And something that's been in the news recently is the birthright citizenship, the 14th Amendment. And that's quite unique in the United States, actually, because most countries in the world do not grant automatic citizenship by birthright. And initially, this applied primarily to white people, and in the late 19th century, it was extended regardless of race through a lawsuit. So this is the nature of the country that we have today, is that we do have birthright citizenship, and the idea is that people can come here and become American. This is quite different than many other places in the world. I have a colleague who works in Switzerland, and we were talking one time about, we both study immigrant kids in schools, and I asked her, and I said, well, who are immigrants in your studies? And she said, well, you know, Italians, and I mean, she started naming a number of different ethnic groups, and I said, well, when did they arrive? And she said, 3-4 generations ago. So it's a very, very different environment that they operate in and that we have in this country. Then the early 20th century, late 19th century, the period of mass migrations and what we think of as the Ellis Island period, an event that occurred then that kind of expresses some of the issues going on at the time was the 1924 Immigration Nationalities Act that limited migration that developed a quota system to limit migration. So migration was limited to 2% of the nationalities who were in the country as of 1890s. They actually rolled back the clock. And the idea was to preserve the United States as a predominantly Northern European country, whereas those coming in at the turn of the century were from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Italians, Jews, and so forth. And then after World War II, we entered a new era where the Cold War was intensified, and a few things happened in the aftermath of the war. One was the boundaries of Europe were redrawn, and there were a number of people left outside of borders of their countries. So, Poland moved over, basically. I mean, like Russia became bigger, and Germany became smaller. And there were a number of people called DPs, displaced persons, who had no place to go. And it was in that context that the UN, which also was formed around that time, formed the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and defined refugees, as I'm sure you know, persons who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So that language is really quite specific to that period of time. People did not have a country they could turn to for protection or a place to go. They were displaced persons camps, and a number of different nations started to take them in as refugees. Then later in the 1950s, when the camps finally closed, it turned out there were still refugees and other refugee crises started to occur, so that definition was extended beyond the European context. And that's the definition that we have today, internationally. And then the 1960s brought the act that probably changed the situation for migration in America the most, which is the 1965 Immigration Nationalities Act, and that abolished the quota system. So as a result of that, the nature of migration into the country changed dramatically, and primarily today we have most immigrants come from Latin America and Asia, increasingly from some African countries, although that's been very, very low until recently. And immigrants, when they arrive, become ethnic minorities in the US. Many of them become ethnic minorities. So that's changed some of the nature of how we think about migration. The Refugee Act established the current refugee resettlement system that we have in 1980, after the 1975 fall of Saigon, when Vietnamese started to come over. And then today, here we are today in a completely new environment and facing new challenges. So we have the notion of the wall and family separations at the border, which are quite troublesome. And this is a graph that shows the blue line shows, and I don't know if you can see the numbers, but I can tell you what they are. So the blue line shows the absolute number of immigrants in the country, and immigrants for the purposes of statisticians are people who are foreign born, at least in the US. So the blue line is the absolute number of immigrants, and in 2016, I believe this one it stops, we were at about 43 million in the US. But the orange line is the proportion of the population of immigrants in the US. And you can see it's had some dips, but we're really not beyond where we were in other periods of US history, particularly 1920s or so. So we're around somewhere 13, 14% of the population. And I think that's important to remember, because while migration seems like a huge issue today, and it seems like how can we possibly absorb all these masses and caravans of people who are coming in, the country has done it before. And look at the Supreme Court. The justices are Jewish, Catholic, people who weren't thought of as being mainstream Americans back in the day. So why do people migrate? Family reunification is the largest reason. Probably 2/3 of immigrants come for family reunification reasons. And sociologists who study the process, Douglas Massey is one of them, talk a lot about how that's the strongest pull for people to come. Having relatives in this country also reduces the various costs of migration, psychological costs of migration, actual costs of migration. And they also come for economic reasons, and that's interesting here because immigrants occupy kind of both extremes of the socioeconomic spectrum when it comes to occupation. Certainly we have a number of migrants who come here to work, labor migrants, but we also have very highly educated and skilled people who end up occupying the higher end of occupational prestige in this country. So for example, 25% of all US physicians are foreign born, and 47% of scientists with PhDs, with doctorates, are foreign born, which is huge. And then people migrate for humanitarian refuge. Increasingly today, we're seeing that from a number of different places, and they're coming both from places that are traditionally thought of as refugee-sending countries, places where there's war, but also places where there's violence not connected to war. And so the issue becomes then those coming from Central America who are escaping violence. Can the argument be made that they are not able to have protection of their own countries? And that discussion continues. So I want to spend a little time talking about these kind of three broad philosophical issues that I think are important here, and that's the concept of human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the concept of social justice that drives a lot of the work on immigration, certainly in community psychology and related disciplines. I think that most people involved with immigration research are concerned for a population that is marginalized. And also issues of cultural diversity. These are groups that come in with a very, very different cultural background. And these three concerns are overlapping, complementary, and in times in conflict. So with respect to human rights, they refer to universal, basic, inalienable rights and humanitarian concerns. And with respect to the crisis at the border, the 1951 Convention for the Status of Refugees states the following, that seeking asylum, now the distinction is made between refugees and asylum seekers. The difference really is refugees are outside a country where they're trying to resettle, and in the US, refugees arrive with refugee status. They've already been screened in refugee camps. But asylum seekers are in a country and are now applying for asylum because they have escaped. And so the convention says, seeking asylum can require refugees to breach immigration laws. Refugees should not be penalized for their illegal entry or stay. And refugees cannot be expelled against their will to a territory where they fear threats to life or freedom. Countries may not forcibly return refugees to a territory where they face danger or discriminate between groups of refugees. So the crisis that we're seeing today, people coming in, crossing the border illegally, asking for asylum, is quite, when seen from a human rights perspective, it's quite consistent with international law. There are estimates that large percentages, probably not all, but large percentages of people crossing the border are eligible for relief. They are eligible for asylum if they apply. Of course, it's a long process. Then the social justice perspective is more related to what happens to people once they arrive and are here to resettle. And that's concerned with equitable distribution of resources, economic, educational, access to healthcare, and so forth, and disparities that exist in this country. And then the cultural diversity view has to do with recognition of difference and the idea that people coming from different backgrounds may have different needs and particular issues that they face that are not universal. So the distinction, I think, between the human rights and a social justice approach is that human rights in a more traditional way define, they're overlapping, and the words human rights and social justice are used within both literatures. But Iris Young, who is a political scientist, a political philosopher, I've been reading a lot of her work, and she talks about how the human rights approach defines oppression as the explicit exercise of tyranny by a ruling group, and we have people running away from those situations. Whereas in social justice movements, oppression is much more about the normal processes of everyday life, not by tyrants, but by social and institutional structures, often perceived as unintentional. So that's really a reframing of what oppression is, and you can see how these two approaches apply in different ways, and many times people who come from more traditional backgrounds, perhaps people who are older, like some of us are getting to be, it's hard for them to think of oppression in this way, but increasingly, of course, that's how we're thinking about it and applying it to the immigrant situation. So John Rawls, who developed the theory of justice, there are two types of social justice that most people talk about. I know there are four, but these are the two that certainly in community psychology most people mention, which is distributive and procedural justice. And distributive justice has to do with the equitable distribution of resources, and procedural with who decides and how do we decide what is fair. But I've been reading the work of Nancy Fraser, who talks about three types of justice, three dimensions of justice. And that's also distributive and procedural, but also what she calls recognitive justice. And so the way she frames it is, distributive justice is about the fair distribution of resources. It's kind of, she talks about it as being about class politics. It's about taking a more etic approach, treating people the same, the idea that everyone should have a fair share, often the same share, de-emphasizing differences. Whereas a recognitive approach has to do with recognition of difference and considering differences in distributive justice. The idea that different people might need different kinds of resources. And this is more associated with what she calls identity politics and sort of an emic approach, which is much more culture-focused and based from within a particular cultural frame. And then procedural justice, she calls it representational, again concerns how do you decide what's just, given that now you have these two major concerns. And so what I want to suggest is that these two competing concerns, the distributive and recognitive justice, are often what we confront, and there's sometimes a tension between the two. So I want to say a few more things about that. So this is a couple of things about culture. So a couple of my favorite quotes. It would hardly be fish who discovered the existence of water, according to Kluckholm. And Jessica Shear's quote, which is, whatever in a culture is stated as if it were natural is precisely what is cultural. The idea here, of course, is that everything we do is cultural. You know, I don't know if you have this experience, but we sometimes have potlucks, and we're supposed to bring dishes representing our cultures. And sometimes people say, like, I don't have a culture, you know, and that's not the case. We all have a culture. All dishes come from a particular cultural frame. And it's important for us to remember that. We can't step outside of a culture to think about culture. I mean, it's sort of a meta thing going on. And so the tension between kind of an oppression perspective and a culture perspective, here's an example of it. This refers to approaches to diversity within the school climate literature. So this is school climate hospitable or not hospitable to immigrants. What is the nature of school climates in schools with diverse kids? This comes from the work of Maya Schachner, who is in Germany, and she framed it, I mean, I'm putting the words distributive and recognitive on it, but she framed it as an equality emphasis and a cultural diversity emphasis. And she contrasts the two. An emphasis on equality is to minimize difference, because diversity is a reason for unequal treatment. And so the task in the school is to undermine stereotyping and prejudice based on perception of difference. It's also linked to a particular type of acculturation, of acculturating to the mainstream culture. But the potential, of course, with overusing this approach is colorblindness, which is the not seeing differences, or not seeing differences, but still, because everything we do is cultural, privileging the culture of the dominant group over the other, and saying that these things are not cultural, but they really are. They really are cultural from the perspective of the dominant group. And of course, the cultural diversity approach in some ways does the opposite, which is it stresses diversity. It thinks about diversity as a resource. It focuses on differences among diverse groups, and has different sets of school practices that go along with that. But the potential there is for segregation and treating a group differently, you know, sort of separate but unequal, having separate programming that don't rise to the same level of quality as those for the mainstream group. So these are the two, here's the tension between the two. A quote from a report in The Lancet, it came out in 2014, that I addresses a lot of this, and I won't spend much time on it, but I encourage you to read it. Napier was the first author, and they really talk about how you can't talk about oppression without talking about culture, right? So while for many people culture is less important than political socioeconomic inequality, it's the culture that frames what that inequality is and looks like. So you cannot have one without the other. And in community psychology, this is, for those of you who are community psychologists, you know this paper, and you know, for us it's foundational, which is Julian Rappaport's In Praise of Paradox. And what he says is that most social problems that we address are not one-sided, but they are paradoxical. The presence of paradox is not a problem. The presence of paradox is a recognition of the need to deal with complexity. So, and when we don't do that, then our solutions become one-sided as well. So in this paper, he talked about the paradoxical nature of human needs and human rights, with human needs being an approach that perhaps has a deficit view of people who are lacking and need services, whereas a human rights has to do with their privileges and rights, and the two sometimes are in conflict. And what I'm arguing is that these two approaches, distributive justice and recognitive justice, are in times in conflict, but we need to find a way to integrate the two of them in interventions and in work and in our society as it deals with immigration. So I want to say a few things about acculturation and adjustment, and much of it does come from this report that I was part of produced by the American Psychological Association. It's available online. The report covers a number of issues that I will mention only briefly. One is there's a large literature in psychology on anti-immigrant sentiment and attitudes in the larger society towards immigrants. There's also, we also talked in the report about immigrant resilience, and part of that is the notion of the immigrant paradox. So the immigrant paradox is the idea that research suggests that immigrants are healthier, that kids who are immigrants have higher educational aspirations than their US-born counterparts. And this also applies to mental health with respect to Latin American immigrants, Mexicans in particular. So that this is paradoxical because they come here because this is a wonderful country, they come for new opportunities, and yet their adjustment with respect to health, mental health, and perhaps education becomes lower in the second generation, and also to some extent over time as they live in the US. So, so the important issue for the research and for the field is to think about, well, what is it that immigrants bring and what is it that they have that are strengths and that contributes to their resilience. So this is a classic definition of acculturation, phenomena which result when groups of individuals having different cultures come into continuous first-hand contact with subsequent changes in the original pattern of either or both groups. Generally, when we talk about acculturation, we're talking about an immigrant group, a minority group, acculturating to the larger society, but the definition is broader than that. And there are three things here that I wanted to highlight. One is that what does continuous contact mean? Well, it can include sojourners or international students who come for a period of time. We live today in a very different world. Used to be immigrants would get on a ship and sail for 3-4 months and come to the US and never go home. And today, the idea is that people go back and forth. So at some point, there's enough sufficient continuous contact to, that acculturation starts to take place. In this definition, it's firsthand, but of course, a few things are going on now. First of all, we have a lot of virtual connections. You know, all immigrants now are Skyping back home or, you know, using social media. Gail Ferguson, who studies Jamaican immigrants in the US, she went to Jamaica and assessed acculturation there, and she found that Jamaican immigrants who have not immigrated to the US, who have never been to the US, are acculturating to American culture. And she calls this remote acculturation. So the idea is, you know, American culture is becoming quite global, and people are adopting aspects of it even without traveling here. And then what does contact mean? And there are different kinds of contact, including voluntary, people who come for better life for jobs, for pull factors, and involuntary, those who are refugees, who are pushed out of where they are. There's also migratory and sedentary, so ethnic minorities, so Native Americans, for example. There's a literature on acculturation of Native Americans. They also have experienced this process. And this is the most well-known and popular theory of, or model of acculturation proposed by John Barry. And the important point that he makes is that acculturation is not only about adopting the new culture, it's also about preserving or not preserving the culture of origin. So assimilation in psychology is not the same thing as acculturation. This is different than in sociology. For sociologists, they use the term to apply across different kinds of what we here call acculturation. So the idea is that somebody can be highly acculturated to the American culture, highly acculturated to the culture of origin, both, neither. They can be separatists, they can be assimilated, and so forth. What I also want to highlight here is that John Barry talks about these as strategies. So the idea he has is that people make choices about how they're going to approach their acculturation experience. So I don't know if you know this movie. This is called The Namesake. It was also a book by Jhumpa Lahiri. It's about a family. The parents are immigrants, and their kids are actually born in the U.S., so they're children of immigrants. They come from India. And I think this picture sort of illustrates some of the different ways in which they're dealing with their acculturation experience. So in the movie, this actually takes place where the parents are taking their kids back to India. I think that they are at the Taj Mahal at the moment. And I think there's so many interesting things about the picture. I mean, for one thing, the way they're dressed. I mean, if you just sort of think about the way they're dressed, I think it tells the entire acculturation story. We have the mom in very traditional dress. The father, who I think it's also, you know, he's dressed in Western clothes, but they're on vacation. And if you've ever been, you know, if you've ever been an American tourist, you know American tourists do not dress like this. They wear sneakers and shorts and so then you have the kids, and the kids who are very Americanized, but they're kind of, you know, the girl, the sister is still, she's got a scarf going on. So she's trying to figure out how to hold on and whether to hold on to her culture. In John Barry's theory, the best way to acculturate is to be bicultural. But what that means is not so clear. In a sense, all four of them are bicultural. All four of them are connected to both cultures to some extent. So the work that I've been doing has, I've been trying to kind of unpack this a little bit and contextualize the acculturation experience, because what is the best type of acculturation? Well, it depends. The biggest thing that it depends on, I think, is developmental differences between those who arrive as adults and those who arrive as children. Also, you know, I question this idea of strategy or choice. People immigrate into an environment where there are attitudes, anti-immigrant attitudes. So can somebody who is experiencing discrimination, can they choose to be bicultural? You know, perhaps not. Can they choose to be assimilated? Perhaps not. So the idea is that it's a combination. Individuals certainly make choices, but they also encounter limitations within their environment. And then I talk about three aspects of acculturation. There are more than three, but the way that I've measured acculturation involves these three, and they're language, identity, and behavior. So one of the confusing things, I think, in psychology, and this is a pet peeve of mine, so I'm sharing it with you, is the distinction between the terms acculturation and enculturation. If you ask anthropologists, this is how they define enculturation. It is the process by which a person learns the requirements of the culture by which he or she is surrounded, and acquires values and behaviors that are appropriate or necessary in that culture. So the reason I say that this is problematic for me, well, the definition is not problematic. The definition is correct. What's problematic is that in the acculturation literature, people have started to refer to attachment to the culture of origin as enculturation, contrasted with becoming more Americanized as acculturation. And I think that this is something that works for adults, but not for kids. Whoops. And let me explain what I mean by that. So for adults, enculturation means socialization into their culture of origin before they came. So they developed, they became adults, they formed identities, and that happened within this culture. And then they come to the new culture and they encounter the new culture. And that's, for them, is when cultural change begins. So for them, these aspects of acculturation, language learning, behavioral acculturation, and identity unfold in this new way. And I think that I could see naming their attachment to the heritage culture as enculturation in that case. For adults, language learning can be difficult. There are some adults who never become fluent in the language. Certainly, the older they are, the less likely they are to. Behaviorally, they enter the labor force. Sometimes they work in ethnic communities and ethnic shops. And Miami, where I'm from, is a great example of a very vibrant ethnic economy among the Cuban refugees. And most studies suggest that when people immigrate as adults, their friendship networks, their close social networks remain within their ethnic community. It's not that they don't get to know Americans, it's not that they don't have friends who are un-Americans, but if you ask them about their closest relationships and closest friends, they tend to remain in their ethnic community. With respect to identity, adults have an established identity, and the biggest difference between adults and children, I guess, is that adults are the ones who make the decision to immigrate, and children do not. So for adults, sometimes they are quite capable of embracing the American identity and think of themselves as hyphenated Americans. But for kids, this experience, I think, is very different, and for them, acculturation and enculturation are intertwined, and I don't think we can any longer make this clear distinction between enculturation and acculturation. So for them, again, enculturation is socialization into the culture that surrounds them, which for them is both the culture of origin and the American culture. And language is a perfect example of this. So there is this sensitive period of up to about 12 when children tend to learn the language very quickly, lose an accent, but at the same time, their heritage language atrophies. They do not, when they're in school, they're not learning in their heritage language. And so I like this term that describes immigrant kids as having kitchen language, sort of their heritage tongue is good enough to use in the kitchen with their parents and household tasks. But they're not learning concepts as they are maturing in school and out of school, right? As adolescents become older, there are a number of different concepts that have now entered their lives, and they're not learning them in their native language. Behaviorally, the American culture is very attractive for immigrant kids, both in good ways and not so good ways. So behavioral acculturation is associated with high-risk behavior for the kids, engaging in sort of drinking and smoking. Well, some immigrants actually smoke more than Americans, but engaging in some high-risk behaviors. And then identity is perhaps, well, I mean, language is very different than adults, but identity is also another area where they're very, very different than adults, because particularly for kids who are members of minority groups in the US, and they experience discrimination, they, Portes and Joe call this reactive identification. They are pushed, or they embrace the culture, their heritage culture, rather than the American culture as a reaction against the discrimination. So American culture rejects them, they reject the American culture. And in the studies that we've done, actually the biggest difference that we see between adolescents and parents when we've looked at parent-adolescent pairs, both Vietnamese and former Soviet, is in the area of identity, and often in the unexpected direction. So it's the kids who feel they're more Vietnamese and more Russian than their parents. So one interesting sort of point here is that both acculturation and ethnic identity are also come from these different views of sort of an oppression emphasis and a cultural emphasis. Acculturation comes out of theories of cultural change, whereas identity theories out of what happens as a result of oppression, although they're both quite related to each other. And kids operate across the different microsystems of their lives, but both cultural influences are there, so that they have to navigate the differences between home and school, which have different cultural demands, and acculturation gaps is one of the things that they experience in their families. So I want to briefly talk about interventions with immigrant and refugee youth, and I'm going to quickly mention some work that I've done in the past on mental health interventions, and then end with the alternate selves as promised. So these are examples of a couple of papers that I've done with programs funded by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is funded by SAMHSA. And these are mental health programs designed to serve refugee immigrant youth who have been traumatized. And those are the papers that we've written based on the data collected there. So the models that were developed in these contexts, these include the Heartland Alliance in Chicago, the International Institute of New Jersey in Jersey City. There's also another organization in Chicago that's used this model. But it's a comprehensive community-based model which is required to work with refugees who have tremendously complex and difficult adjustment issues. So very briefly, this was a study that we did. They described their work as relationship building with the community, and they were located in 2 school districts, conducting outreach with a lot of kids, spending time getting to know kids, letting them get to know them, and then providing clinical services to a fraction of those who needed the more targeted interventions. And this was an example of implementing an evidence-based practice, TFCBT, trauma-focused CBT. And of the about 150 kids that they served, 50 received TFCBT. Those were the kids that reported a particular traumatic event that they needed to process, and they received that treatment. We did find, we did not have a control group, but we did look at cumulative amount of services at each point. We measured them multiple times, probably up to 6 times. And the amount of services they received, different kinds of services, predicted reduction in symptoms and better functioning, including supportive therapy, generic CBT techniques, and coordination or case management services, and TFCBT. TFCBT was associated with better functioning and reduced symptoms, but only 15 of the kids completed 10 or more sessions of TFCBT because other stuff happened. Other things came up. They could not continue to focus on that particular protocol, and the clinicians were flexible enough to work with them and go outside of the evidence-based practice to provide what they needed. I will just mention it here. I have a student who just finished this. We found these interviews that were sitting around with clinicians involved in those projects, and she analyzed their experience of providing services in this way. And I don't know if you can see it, but I will just summarize this for you very, very quickly. She talked about the complexity, the context of complexity in immigrant and refugee lives, and which you can't see, there's also this cultural continuum between the culture of the clinician and the culture of the refugees, and the need to bridge that divide. And so what she found was that what the clinicians talked about was the primacy and importance of the therapeutic relationship, but not in the way that we usually think about it. So, because these were relationships not only with the individual clients, these were relationships with the families and with the communities. When they had referrals to Child Protective Services, they had to think very carefully about how is this going to affect our relationship with the Liberian community, for example. That was or Burundian community. So they had to forge these relationships in very complicated ways. And on the other hand, they found that their training did not prepare them for this kind of work, because the kind of boundaries that they were trained to maintain in therapeutic relationships were bridged all the time. So the reason I wanted to talk about this here just briefly is to say that to me this is an example of kind of the need for a particular emic, culturally sensitive perspective to address the needs of these kids whose needs and the work with whom does not fit into the traditional practices that we have or the training models that we have for clinicians. And now the educational interventions. So these are the instructional approaches in schools that target refugee immigrant students. At the elementary school level, bilingual education is an approach that's used sometimes. It makes a lot of sense. It's related to how kids learn to read in their native language. It's a support to them. It scaffolds their learning. Pull-out instruction in English, and also some content level instruction at the higher levels, at middle school and high school level. There are newcomer centers or specialized centers that serve refugees within the school, and also newcomer high schools. New York has some, San Francisco has some, that are aimed at educating kids within 4 years of arrival. But what I'm really interested in is this population, the late arriving students. These are kids who arrive in adolescence. Their needs are quite distinct from the kids who are younger, who are born here. They need to master the language of instruction and academic content at the same time, and they're at risk for dropping out of school. And what's happening around the country is that schools are turning away immigrant kids who are age 16 and older from high schools, are not allowing them to register, and are steering them to GED programs. The history of GED programs is very interesting. Originally, they were developed to address the needs of US-born adults returning from military service, those who did not have a chance to finish high school. And originally, there was a concern that there would be an incentive to drop out of school, so you had to be 20 years or older to be in a GED program, and that's gradually been decreased. And research shows that those who go to GED versus high school do not attain the same educational and career objectives. And there's been increasingly this concern that these programs are adolescenticized, which is that increasingly 16, 17-year-olds are enrolling in these programs, and the concern is that schools are pushing them out. Not only immigrant kids, but especially immigrant kids. So this was an article that came out in the Miami Herald, concerned that this is happening to immigrant kids. It's a very controversial issue around the country. There have been several lawsuits in several states, and in Miami, we entered kind of this area trying to study the situation. My work is very much in collaboration with the Office for Refugee Resettlement and the resettlement program in the state of Florida. And what they've done in Florida is, in response to this concern, they've created specialized programs for these kids. So they are technically GED programs. They're Spanish language GED programs, so the kids can take the GED in Spanish, but they're located within high schools. So what they've done is provide these kids with the opportunity to essentially attend school, but not really. So they're in school during the day, they have lunch with the other kids, they wear uniforms. School is from Monday through Thursday, so it actually gives them a little time off. Here's an article about one of these programs. But the instruction, what the kids are actually getting in the classroom is test prep. They're preparing to take the GED exam in Spanish. There is an English language version of the program too, but most of them are in Spanish. So the Office of Refugee, or the State Office of Refugee Resettlement said, we think this is a good idea. We like the fact that we did this, but we don't know, is this serving these kids or not? So we said, well, let's find out. So we did a study of kids in these programs. I know you can't read this, so I'll just tell you that we interviewed 37 kids across 5 programs. All were 16 to 18 in arrival. And this is Miami, the majority came from Cuba. We also had kids from Venezuela, which is an increasing number, Honduras, Salvador, and Ecuador. And so these were the pathways that these kids had to the GED programs. So 5 of the kids we interviewed who currently were in these specialized GED programs did not want to go to high school. They came and they said, GED is better for me. All of them happened to be Cuban. All of them happened to be doing this on the advice of their family and friends, because there's a very large Cuban community, and this is a path that they've seen in the past, and this is what made sense to them. But 32 of the kids, they expected to go to high school and to receive a high school diploma. of those, this was grounded theory. We did negative case sampling, and we found a kid who was able to enroll in high school, wanted to make sure to talk to her, to somebody like that. One of the kids was given an option to go to high school if he could pass an English test, but he chose the GED. And 30 were steered towards SMA. These were called Success Management Academies, these GED programs. Now, what do I mean steered? Some were told, this would actually be better for you. There's a special program for immigrant kids. Here's a brochure. Let me tell you, where it is in the school building. And the kids went there. Other kids wanted to go to high school, and they went to multiple schools to try to register, and they were told no. And when this was kind of an, like in medical research, when you have an early finding, you inform people, you do something. This was an early finding in our study. We went straight to the office and we said, this is happening, and they've been trying to address this. So the school district is trying to address this issue because it's not legal. School staff should not be doing this. They cannot turn kids away in that way. So, but what we also found is that for many kids, the program was sort of like a supportive transitional program, and they really appreciated it. It was in Spanish, it was with other kids who were just like them. The teachers spoke Spanish, the teachers could culture broker, the teacher and advocate for them. They also had some friends who were in the high school, maybe they'd arrived earlier, like one kid his girlfriend was in the high school, and he said, it's harder for her. I mean, she experiences a lot of discrimination, and we don't get that here. And they described this as, it's like a big family, is how they felt about it. But then others felt that they were directed to an adult education program. This was not challenging. A number of them were quite proud of their educational accomplishments. And we do have a kid who said, I thought it was going to be like the High School Musical. But another kid who said, this is okay. I was worried about it, but I came in and it's okay. I can get through. I'll get my diploma. It won't take me very long. So there were kind of a variety of opinions. I mean, one of the reasons kids did not like this arrangement also was because they felt they would learn English better in high school, which is, I'm sure, the case. We know that. Kids surrounded by others who speak their language would pick it up quicker. So this is where we came to this concept of alternate selves and trying to understand their experience. These are some of the quotes from the kids, and it is really striking how ambitious their aspirations were. And when we asked them sort of, what did you want, what were your hopes? And they said, well, I want an education because I want to be somebody. I want to have a big future. And they talked about essentially the American dream is what they described. And there is this concept in psychology, possible selves. Marcus and Nurius came up with it. It's been used in research and interventions. And so essentially, these are cognitive representations of an aspirational self, a positive vision of a self. And Daphne Oyserman in particular does research on helping kids develop, minority kids in African-American communities, develop a positive sense of self, a positive idea of who they're going to become, an idea that they can be successful academically, they can be successful in terms of a career. And there are two components that they work with. One is the aspiration, and the other is a plan. Because if you don't have a plan for how to get there, you can wish to be an astronaut, but not going to happen. But what we found with these kids is that they did have a possible self. I mean, aspirations was not a problem. They aimed very high. They were very ambitious. And so they had these aspirations of a possible self, even in their country of origin, but their possible selves were impossible because of the circumstances. Venezuelan and Cuban kids talked about that. And so then they imagined this different possibilities, sort of an alternate universe, an alternate self that they would become in the United States. And of course, the concern or what we saw was that for many of them, being steered to GED and having this experience was a threat to this imagined self. So they had to adjust and cope with it and reimagine it. And what we found was that probably the biggest finding that we had is that they did not have good information. They did not know how to get there. Some did not. We did find some kids who were very successful. One kid is now on full scholarship at a prestigious art school. He came with his portfolio, and went through the GED, and he's doing great. Another kid is becoming a pharmacist. He knew what he had to do. He apprenticed in a CVS, and then he's now studying. But probably the saddest piece that we saw were kids who really downgraded their ambitions without necessarily realizing that they had done that. So somebody who wanted to be a doctor is studying to be a phlebotomist or some kind of medical technician, and not being clear whether this, I'll do this first and I'll become a doctor later, or if this is going to be it. Or a kid who wanted to be a pilot is studying to be an airplane mechanic again. And part of the confusion is that these kind of vocational schools were called colleges. So kids would talk about how I'm going to college, I'm going to go to college, and this is what I'm going to do. And it was not clear to them that this was not a college. So was this just? Yes and no, right? I mean, so for those kids who needed the specialized supports, with respect to recognitive justice, yes, it was just. For those kids who wanted what everybody else had. American kids do not get turned away from high school, right? It doesn't matter how old, if they're 16, they still can go to high school. It was unjust. They were not being treated equally. So from the distributive justice perspective, it was not just. Resolving that paradox between, those two kinds of justice is what's important for us to figure out in programming for kids. But the important thing here is that they did not have a right to choose. And that's the solution that's being proposed in a lot of places, is that high school be the default, and that there needs to be an active deselect, sort of choosing not to go to high school, because these kids did not have a choice. So I want to say just that adolescence is a paradox, right? So these kids, they're not adults and they're not children. And the narrative of the adult immigrant is somebody who comes to this country, works hard and sacrifices, and even if they were, scientists or whatever, they will become taxi drivers and take less prestigious jobs for the sake of their kids. I mean, they do the journey and they adjust in this way because of their children. It's called the Immigrant Bargain, right? So I will sacrifice, but you succeed. And then you have their children who brought you here, you were young, you can go on, you can develop, you can do what you want. And these kids, the adolescents who arrive in this age group, they fall squarely between these two narratives, right? So what are they going to do? Are they young enough to do the American dream the way that the children do, or do they have to make these sacrifices and adjustments? And this is what we need to figure out how to do as educational resettlement systems. And this is why I think this group is so important to focus on, because there's such a danger that with all of this ambition and all these hopes, that they do not end up getting there. So this is the current direction where I'm going. I have a colleague at University of Miami, Leanne Tran, and she's in the School of Communications, and she designs games for social justice. Two of the games that she's done, there's Cops and Rubbers for streetwalkers, women in prostitution, to it's a scenario-based game where the idea is, I don't know, I don't play those games, but kids who do, they tell me that you are this person, and here's your situation, here are your circumstances. You need to decide what to do, and you make a decision, and then something happens. You roll the dice if it's a board game, or electronically something happens. And it's a tool to teach those who are going through this experience, and also those working with these populations, what it's like. Toma El Paso is a board game for unaccompanied minors, helping them understand the legal system. It's kind of like the game of life in that context. So what we're working on now is taking some of the narratives of these kids and collecting more, particularly those who are now beyond these programs and are now older, maybe in their 20s. So how did they get to where they are today? And we want to develop a game. I don't know yet if it's going to be a board game, if it's going to be an electronic game, if it's going to be both, or really a tool to help them make these decisions. Because this is what we identified as being the biggest problem. They don't know what they don't know. They make all kinds of assumptions, and they make really bad choices at this very, very critical moment in time where they could be succeeding.